The Vikings reached America 500 years before Columbus, established thriving colonies, and found a land rich with timber, game, and resources beyond their wildest dreams. Yet after just 15 years, they abandoned everything and sailed back to Greenland, never to return. Archaeological evidence reveals why the most successful explorers in medieval history gave up on the greatest prize they ever discovered. This is the untold story of Vinland, the Viking name for North America, where Norse explorers established the first European settlements in the New World. From Leif Erikson's discovery to the final evacuation, we'll explore how Vikings created a functioning colony 500 years before Columbus, and why they ultimately chose to abandon paradise. Around 1000 AD, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland following reports of land sighted by Bjarni Herjolfsson. After days of ocean sailing, the Vikings encountered three distinct regions: Helluland, flat stone land; Markland, forest land; and finally Vinland, a paradise of grapes, salmon, and endless forests. What the Vikings found in Vinland exceeded their wildest expectations. After the barren landscapes of Iceland and Greenland, America offered unlimited timber for shipbuilding, salmon runs that dwarfed anything in Scandinavia, wild grapes for wine, and fertile soil that could support large-scale agriculture. This was the richest land any Viking had ever seen. Encouraged by these discoveries, the Vikings established their first permanent settlement at what they called Straumfjörður. Archaeological evidence from Lonsall Meadows in Newfoundland reveals sophisticated buildings, workshops for ironworking, and facilities for ship repair. Proof of a well-planned colony designed for long-term occupation. Success at Straumfjörður encouraged further exploration and settlement. Thorvald Eriksson led expeditions south, mapping coastlines and identifying sites for additional colonies. The Vikings envisioned a chain of settlements along the American coast, creating a new realm that would rival their European territories. The Vikings quickly organized systematic extraction of America's wealth. They harvested timber for export to treeless Greenland, collected furs from abundant wildlife, and prepared to establish permanent trade routes. Ship after ship returned to Greenland, laden with American riches that amazed the European settlements. The Vikings weren't alone in America. They soon encountered peoples they called Skrælings, most likely the ancestors of Native American tribes. Initial contacts were peaceful, even profitable, with Vikings trading metal tools and weapons for furs and local knowledge of the land and its resources. For several years, Vikings and Skrælings maintained profitable relationships. Native Americans provided invaluable knowledge about American geography, seasonal patterns, and survival techniques, while Vikings offered metal tools, weapons, and European goods that revolutionized Native American technology. Despite the promise of Vinland, Viking settlement faced a fundamental problem: population. Greenland could only spare a few hundred colonists, while America's vast territories required thousands of settlers to establish secure territories. The Vikings were simply too few to control the land they had discovered. Maintaining colonies 1,000 miles from Greenland created enormous logistical challenges. Supply ships faced dangerous Atlantic crossings, unpredictable weather, and the constant risk of being lost at sea. Each voyage was a major expedition requiring months of preparation and substantial resources. American colonists lived in complete isolation from European civilization. News, supplies, and reinforcements arrived only sporadically. Colonists had to be completely self-sufficient for months or years at a time, a psychological burden that wore down even experienced Vikings accustomed to harsh conditions. Peaceful relations with Native Americans began to deteriorate as Vikings expanded their territory and resource extraction. Competing claims over hunting grounds, misunderstandings about land ownership, and cultural conflicts over resource use created tensions that escalated into open hostility. The sagas record increasingly violent conflicts between Vikings and Skrælings. Native Americans, initially impressed by Viking metal weapons, quickly adapted their tactics and began coordinated attacks on Viking settlements. What had been profitable trade relationships transformed into constant warfare. In America, Vikings faced tactical disadvantages they had never encountered. Native Americans used forest warfare, hit-and-run tactics, and superior knowledge of terrain to neutralize Viking advantages in armor and weapons. The Europeans found themselves outmaneuvered in an unfamiliar environment. Viking settlements became armed camps under constant threat. Colonists could no longer safely harvest timber, hunt, or farm outside fortified areas. The very activities that made American colonization profitable became impossibly dangerous, trapped within their own defensive perimeters. Native Americans proved remarkably adaptable in military technology. They quickly learned to make and use metal weapons, developed new tactics to counter Viking armor, and organized coordinated attacks that overwhelmed isolated settlements. The technological advantage that gave Vikings superiority elsewhere proved temporary in America. Constant warfare took a devastating toll on Viking colonies. The sagas record significant casualties among colonists, including prominent leaders. Each death not only reduced the already small population, but also eliminated experienced individuals essential for colonial survival. The psychological impact of constant threat broke Viking morale. These were men and women accustomed to raiding and warfare, but the persistent danger of American forests created a fear they had never experienced. Even hardened Vikings began questioning whether Vinland was worth the constant terror. Conflicts increasingly centered on resource control. Native Americans recognized that Viking resource extraction threatened their traditional way of life. Forests being cleared, hunting grounds disrupted, and seasonal patterns altered by European activities created existential threats to indigenous survival. Native American resistance became increasingly organized as different tribes formed alliances against Viking expansion. These confederations coordinated attacks, shared intelligence, and developed unified strategies that overwhelmed isolated Viking settlements through superior numbers and local knowledge. American winters proved especially challenging for Viking colonies under siege. Unable to hunt or gather resources safely, settlements faced starvation. Supply ships from Greenland couldn't navigate winter Atlantic storms, leaving colonists completely isolated during the most demanding season. By the 10th year, Viking colonists debated abandoning America. Leaders argued whether to reinforce colonies with more settlers and military support, or cut losses and evacuate. The debates revealed fundamental disagreements about the viability of American settlement. Meanwhile, Greenland itself faced mounting challenges. Climate cooling reduced agricultural productivity, making it harder to supply American colonies. Ice conditions worsened, making Atlantic crossings more dangerous and unpredictable. Greenland could barely support itself, let alone distant American settlements. Cost-benefit analysis turned against American colonization. While Vinland offered abundant resources, the expense of maintaining supply lines, defending settlements, and replacing casualties exceeded the economic benefits. America was profitable in theory, but ruinously expensive in practice. A series of coordinated Native American attacks in the 15th year proved decisive. Multiple Viking settlements came under simultaneous assault by well-organized indigenous forces. The attacks demonstrated that Native Americans had developed the organization and tactics necessary to eliminate Viking presence entirely. Following the devastating attacks, Viking leaders made the painful decision to abandon America. The costs had become unbearable. Constant casualties, economic drain, psychological trauma, and the growing realization that Native American resistance would only intensify with time. Evacuation required careful planning to salvage what they could from 15 years of colonization. Vikings dismantled valuable equipment, loaded ships with portable wealth, and prepared to transport colonists back to Greenland. Everything too large or heavy to transport was abandoned to the wilderness. The final Viking ships departed America around 1015 AD, carrying the last European colonists who wouldn't return for 500 years. As they sailed east toward Greenland, they left behind empty settlements, abandoned workshops, and dreams of a Norse empire in the New World. After the Viking departure, silence descended over their American settlements. Native Americans reclaimed the abandoned sites, forests began to overgrow Viking buildings, and within decades, most traces of European presence had been erased by nature and time. The Viking experience in America was preserved in the Icelandic sagas, particularly the Saga of the Greenlanders and Saga of Eric the Red. These oral traditions, written down centuries later, maintained memory of Vinland even as the actual location was forgotten by European civilization. For 500 years, Viking exploration of America remained a historical footnote known only through Icelandic sagas. European scholars dismissed these accounts as mythology until 20th century archaeology proved that Vikings had indeed established settlements in the New World. In 1960, Norwegian explorers Helge and Anstein Ingstad discovered the remains of Viking buildings at Meadows in Newfoundland. Careful excavation revealed irrefutable proof of Viking settlement. Norse-style buildings, ironworking sites, and artifacts unmistakably Scandinavian in origin. Excavations revealed sophisticated Viking settlement infrastructure. 8 buildings including workshops, dwellings, and storage facilities. Iron slag from metalworking, ship repair areas, and distinctive Scandinavian construction techniques prove this was no temporary camp but a planned permanent settlement. Carbon dating of organic materials from Meadows confirmed occupation around 1000 AD, exactly matching the timeline recorded in the sagas. This vindicated centuries of dismissed oral tradition and proved Viking America was historical fact, not mythology. Meadows was clearly not the only Viking site in America. The settlement was too small to account for the extensive exploration described in the sagas. Archaeologists continue searching for additional Viking sites along the North American coast. Oral traditions among some Native American groups preserve memories of European visitors centuries before Columbus. These stories, long dismissed by historians, gain new credibility in light of archaeological proof of Viking presence and describe encounters matching saga accounts. Viking settlements left subtle but detectable environmental changes. Analysis of pollen samples and soil chemistry reveals European agricultural practices, introduced plant species, and land use patterns different from Native American traditions. These environmental markers help archaeologists locate potential Viking sites. Vikings introduced ironworking technology to North America 500 years before other Europeans. Some Native American groups acquired metalworking skills through contact with Vikings, creating a technological legacy that persisted long after Viking departure. Climate change contributed to Viking abandonment of America. The medieval warm period that enabled Viking expansion was ending around 1000 AD. Cooling temperatures made Atlantic crossings more dangerous and reduced agricultural productivity in Greenland, undermining support for American colonies. If Vikings had successfully colonized America, world history would have been fundamentally different. European contact with Native Americans might have occurred gradually over centuries rather than suddenly in 1492, potentially creating very different patterns of cultural exchange and conflict. When Columbus reached America in 1492, he was unknowingly following routes Vikings had pioneered 500 years earlier. Unlike Vikings, Columbus had the backing of a major European power, larger population base, and economic systems capable of sustaining long-distance colonization. America's resource abundance that attracted Vikings remained largely untapped for 500 years after their departure. The timber, furs, and mineral wealth that Vikings had discovered waited for subsequent European explorers who arrived with greater resources and different colonial strategies. Viking navigation of the North Atlantic represents one of history's greatest maritime achievements. Using only primitive instruments, they successfully crossed 1,000 miles of open ocean to reach America and maintained supply lines for 15 years, a feat that wouldn't be repeated until Columbus. Viking American settlements showed sophisticated planning and organization. The layout of Meadows reveals careful consideration of defense, resource access, and expansion potential. These weren't random camps, but well-designed permanent communities. American Vikings lived in complete cultural isolation from European civilization. Cut off from Scandinavian traditions, Christian influence, and European news, they developed unique adaptations to American conditions while struggling to maintain Norse identity. Viking women played crucial roles in American colonization. Sagas mention female colonists who managed households, raised children in wilderness conditions, and maintained family traditions. Their experiences represent some of the earliest European women's lives in America. American seasons posed unique challenges for Vikings accustomed to Scandinavian conditions. Longer, hotter summers and different winter patterns required adaptation of agricultural techniques, clothing, and housing. Learning American seasonal rhythms took years of experience. Viking departure from America disrupted nascent trade networks between European and Native American societies. The cultural and technological exchange that had begun to develop was abruptly terminated, leaving both sides without the benefits of continued contact. The failure of American colonization contributed to Greenland's eventual decline. Without American resources to supplement their economy, Greenland Vikings struggled with climate cooling and isolation. By 1500, the Greenland colonies had completely disappeared. The preservation of Vinland sagas represents remarkable historical continuity. Despite the failure of American colonies, Icelandic storytellers maintained accurate accounts for centuries, preserving details that proved historically accurate when finally verified by archaeology. Finding Viking sites in America remains challenging because they were deliberately abandoned and quickly overgrown. Unlike stone structures that survive for millennia, Viking wooden buildings decompose rapidly in American climates, leaving only subtle traces for archaeologists to discover. Contemporary archaeologists continue searching for additional Viking sites using advanced techniques like ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and environmental analysis. Each new discovery adds pieces to the puzzle of Viking presence in America. Despite their brief presence, Vikings left lasting impacts on North American culture through place names, archaeological sites, and cultural memories preserved in both Scandinavian and Native American traditions. Their legacy transcends their short-lived colonial presence. Viking exploration of America embodied the same spirit that drove them across Europe and the Atlantic. Their willingness to venture into unknown territories and attempt colonization far from home demonstrates the remarkable courage and ambition that characterized Viking culture. Economic analysis reveals why Viking American colonization failed, where later European efforts succeeded. Vikings lacked the population base, financial resources, and institutional support necessary for successful long-distance colonization in hostile environments. Viking experience in America taught important lessons about colonial warfare. Traditional European military advantages, armor, weapons, and tactics, proved insufficient against indigenous peoples using familiar terrain and guerrilla warfare techniques. Demographics ultimately doomed Viking American colonies. A few hundred settlers couldn't establish permanent control over territories inhabited by thousands of Native Americans. The population imbalance made long-term colonial success impossible, regardless of other factors. Cultural misunderstandings between Vikings and Native Americans escalated conflicts unnecessarily. Different concepts of land ownership, resource rights, and diplomatic protocol created tensions that might have been avoided with better cultural translation and understanding. Despite their departure, Vikings contributed to technological diffusion in North America. Ironworking techniques, European agricultural methods, and navigation knowledge spread among Native American groups, influencing technological development long after Viking colonies disappeared. After Viking departure, North American environments quickly returned to pre-contact conditions. The relatively small scale and brief duration of Viking presence meant their environmental impact was minimal and easily reversed by natural processes. The irony of Viking American colonization is profound. The most successful maritime explorers of their age abandoned the richest prize they ever discovered. Their failure in America demonstrates that even remarkable courage and skill cannot overcome impossible odds and inadequate resources. For 500 years after Viking departure, European civilization remained ignorant of American existence. Maps showed only ocean where Vikings had found continents, and European explorers discovered lands that Scandinavian adventurers had already explored and abandoned. If Vikings had successfully established permanent American colonies, the entire timeline of European expansion would have been different. America might have been gradually incorporated into European civilization over centuries, rather than suddenly conquered in decades. Native American resistance to Viking colonization represents one of history's most successful indigenous defenses against European expansion. Organized resistance, tactical adaptation, and strategic coordination achieved what no other indigenous peoples managed until much later periods. The North Atlantic itself proved to be Vikings' greatest enemy. Dangerous crossings, unpredictable weather, and ice conditions made maintaining American colonies extremely difficult. Geography and climate ultimately defeated Viking colonial ambitions. Both Viking and Native American cultures preserved memories of their encounter through oral traditions. These parallel cultural memories, maintained independently for centuries, provide remarkable validation of historical events when compared with archaeological evidence. Modern science continues to validate saga accounts of Viking America through new archaeological discoveries, environmental analysis, and advanced dating techniques. Each scientific advance adds credibility to oral traditions once dismissed as mythology. Viking exploration of America inspired later Scandinavian involvement in New World colonization. Swedish and Danish colonies in America can trace their inspiration partly to saga accounts of Viking achievements, continuing the Norse tradition of American exploration.